I was born in a gas station parking lot off Route 9 inches Harlan County, Kentucky, while my mother screamed at the attendant to call an ambulance that never came. She was 19. She didn't even have a name picked out. The paramedics who finally arrived wrote Baby Girl Dawson on the form, and my mother let it stick for 3 days before a nurse at the county hospital convinced her to fill in something real. She chose Elena. No middle name. She said middle names were for people who planned on keeping their children. She didn't keep me long. For the first 4 years of my life, I lived in the back of whatever apartment, trailer, or borrowed room my mother, Jolene Dawson, happened to land in that month. She was the kind of woman people described with a sigh and a shake of the head. Pretty once, they'd say, as though beauty were a currency she'd already spent. She drank more than she ate, loved men who hit her, and treated me like furniture she couldn't figure out how to return. I don't remember her face from those years. I remember sounds. The clink of bottles. The bass thump of music through thin walls. The sound of doors slamming in the middle of the night, and the silence that followed when she didn't come back for days. I ended up with my great-aunt, Opal Dawson, the way most unwanted children end up somewhere through exhaustion and paperwork. Child Protective Services got involved after a neighbor called about a little girl sitting alone on a porch step in February with no shoes. Jolene was gone. Nobody knew where. Opal, who was 62 and had already raised 4 children of her own, signed the guardianship papers not because she wanted another mouth to feed, but because she believed letting family go into the system was a sin worse than poverty. Opal's house sat on 2 acres of hard clay outside Corbin, a small town where everybody knew your business, and nobody let you forget it. The house was clean but tired, with sagging gutters and a porch that creaked like an old man's knees. Inside, everything had a place. Dishes stacked by size. Towels folded in thirds. Shoes lined up by the door like soldiers awaiting orders. Opal ran her household the way she ran her life, with discipline, silence, and the unshakable belief that softness made people weak. She fed me. She clothed me. She made sure I went to school with my hair combed and my homework finished. But she never once told me she loved me. She never asked what I dreamed about, or what scared me, or what I wanted to be when I grew up. She believed children should be grateful for a roof, and that gratitude didn't require conversation. When I cried, she told me tears were a waste of water. When I tried to hug her, she stiffened like I'd startled her. After a while, I stopped trying. I learned the rules of Opal's house the way animals learn electric fences, through careful observation and occasional pain. Don't ask for seconds. Don't leave lights on. Don't talk back, don't talk too much, don't talk about your mother. That last one was the hardest. Because Jolene kept showing up. She'd appear every few months, always unannounced, always smelling like cheap perfume and bad decisions. She'd crouch down and squeeze my face between her hands and tell me how much she missed me, how she was getting clean, how she was saving up for a place big enough for both of us. Her eyes would be glassy and bright, full of promises that evaporated the moment she walked back to whatever car was idling at the curb. I believed her every single time. I believed her when I was 5, when I was 8, when I was 12. I believed her the way drowning people believe in lifeboats that never arrive. Opal had no patience for it. That woman couldn't keep a plant alive, she'd mutter after Jolene left. Stop looking at the door like she's coming back. But I always looked. By high school, I had perfected the art of being invisible. I sat in the back of every classroom, spoke only when called on, ate lunch alone in the library with a book I wasn't really reading. I wasn't bullied exactly. Bullying requires someone to notice you exist. I was simply overlooked, a quiet girl in secondhand clothes who never raised her hand and never caused trouble. Teachers wrote the same thing on every report card. Elena is a pleasant, well-behaved student who could benefit from more class participation. They had no idea that participation required a kind of confidence I had never been taught to have. When I was 16, Opal's husband, Uncle Ray, died. He'd been the closest thing I had to warmth in that house. A gentle, slow-moving man who smelled like pipe tobacco and motor oil, who sometimes left a butterscotch candy on my nightstand without saying a word. His heart gave out on a Saturday morning while he was fixing the lawnmower in the garage. Opal found him slumped against the wheel well, still holding a wrench. She didn't cry at the funeral. She didn't cry after. She just got quieter, harder, smaller, like grief was compressing her into stone. After Uncle Ray died, the house felt like a museum. Everything preserved, nothing alive. I moved through it on tiptoe, afraid that any noise might shatter whatever fragile thing was holding Opal together. I cooked dinner without being asked. I washed dishes before she could reach the sink. I made myself so small, so useful, so perfectly behaved that sometimes I wondered if I'd disappeared entirely. Senior year came and went without ceremony. I graduated near the top of my class, but Opal didn't come to the ceremony. She said she didn't feel well, which might have been true, but I suspect she simply didn't think it was important. I walked across the stage in a borrowed cap and gown, shook the principal's hand, and drove myself home in Uncle Ray's old Buick. That night, I sat on the back porch and stared at the stars and made a decision. I was going to leave Corbin. I was going to study nursing at the community college in Lexington. I was going to build a life where I mattered to someone, anyone, even if I had to build it brick by brick with my bare hands. I didn't tell Opal about my plan. I just enrolled, found a shared apartment with 2 other students, and started classes in the fall. She didn't argue. She didn't wish me luck. She said, "Don't expect me to send money," and turned back to her television. That was her goodbye. Lexington was the first place I ever felt like a real person. The campus was noisy and bright, full of people who talked too loud and laughed for no reason, and I loved every chaotic second of it even though I didn't know how to be part of it. I studied harder than anyone in my cohort. I showed up early, stayed late, volunteered for extra shifts at the campus health clinic. Nursing made sense to me in a way nothing else ever had. The precision of it, the rules, the protocols, they felt like Opal's house, except this time, the structure served a purpose I believed in. I was learning to take care of people. I was learning that hands could heal instead of hit, that attention could be a gift instead of a burden. It was during a clinical rotation at the University of Kentucky Medical Center that I met Daniel Reeves. He came into the ER on a Thursday night with a dislocated shoulder and a grin that had no business being on the face of a man in that much pain. He was 26, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a voice like gravel wrapped in honey. A volunteer firefighter and part-time carpenter who'd fallen off a ladder while helping a neighbor patch a roof. "You're handling this remarkably well," I told him, adjusting his IV line. "Well," he said, wincing as the doctor reset his shoulder, "I figure crying won't put my arm back in the socket, so I might as well make conversation." "What's your name?" Nobody had ever asked me that with such genuine curiosity. Like my name was something worth knowing. "Elena," I said. "Elena," he repeated, as though tasting the word. "That's a good name, strong." I should have kept it professional. I should have finished my notes and moved on to the next patient. But Daniel Reeves had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room, and I'd spent my entire life feeling like no person at all. He came back 2 weeks later with a box of donuts for the nursing staff and a shy, slightly rehearsed speech about how he didn't usually do this kind of thing, but would I maybe want to get coffee sometime. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Our first date was at a diner near campus where the coffee was terrible and the pie was worse. We sat in a cracked vinyl booth for 4 hours. Daniel told me about growing up on his family's small farm outside Richmond, about his father who taught him to build things, and his mother who taught him to notice people. I told him almost nothing about myself, not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't know how to make my past sound like something someone would want to hear. Daniel didn't push, he just kept showing up. Coffee dates turned into long drives through the countryside. Long drives turned into dinners at his mother's kitchen table, where his parents treated me with a warmth so foreign, I almost couldn't breathe. His mother, Linda, hugged me the first time we met. Not a polite, arm's-length hug. A real one. The kind where you can feel the other person's heartbeat. I stood rigid in her arms, terrified and grateful, and completely unable to process the fact that a stranger was holding me like I was worth holding. Daniel proposed on a cold January evening, standing in the parking lot of the diner where we'd had our first date. No ring yet. just his hands wrapped around mine and his voice cracking as he told me he'd never met anyone who made him want to be better the way I did. I said yes, with tears streaming down my cheeks, ugly crying in a parking lot in Lexington, Kentucky, while a trucker at the gas pump next door pretended not to watch. We were married 3 months later at the Richmond courthouse. His parents came. A few of his friends. Opal didn't answer when I called to invite her. I wore a white sundress from a thrift store, and Daniel wore his only suit, and when the judge said, "You may kiss the bride," he kissed me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. We settled into a small rental house outside Richmond, and for the first time in my 23 years, I understood what it meant to feel safe. Not the rigid, rule-bound safety of Opal's house, but the warm, breathing kind. The kind where someone leaves the porch light on for you. Where someone saves you the last piece of chicken without being asked. Where someone pulls you close in the middle of the night and whispers, "I'm right here," when you jerk awake from another nightmare about being left behind. Daniel took a full-time job with the county fire department while I finished my nursing degree. Money was tight, but it was the good kind of tight, the kind where you eat rice and beans on Tuesday because you're saving for a crib. Because our first daughter, Lily, was on her way. She arrived on a September morning with a full head of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. I held her against my chest and sobbed. Not from pain, not from exhaustion. From the overwhelming, almost terrifying realization that I loved someone more than I had ever loved anything, and that this tiny creature would never, ever wonder if she was wanted. I swore it in that delivery room like an oath. She would know she was loved every single day of her life. 2 more girls skinning. Rosie came 18 months later, loud and fearless from the moment she drew breath. Then, Cora, the quiet one, born with wide gray eyes and a habit of watching the world with the patience of someone much older than 3. Our little house grew louder, messier, more alive with every child. The laundry was endless. The grocery bills were absurd. Daniel worked overtime and came home smelling like smoke and sweat, and I worked night shifts at the county hospital, and we passed each other like ships some days, but every night we made it back to the same shore. Then came the twins. I found out I was carrying 2 boys during a routine ultrasound that was supposed to be unremarkable. The technician paused, moved the wand, paused again. "Well," she said slowly, "I hope you have a big car." I laughed. Then I panicked. Then I cried in the parking lot while Daniel rubbed my back and told me we'd figure it out, the way he always told me we'd figure everything out, with that steady certainty that made me believe him even when the math didn't work. Caleb and Micah were born on a stormy March night, 6 weeks early. Caleb screamed his way into the world like he was angry about being evicted. But Micah was quiet. Too quiet. He didn't cry for a long time, and when he did, it was thin, reedy, like a sound traveling from very far away. The neonatologist found the problem within hours. A complex congenital heart defect, the kind that shows up on medical charts with long Latin names and short survival timelines. The left ventricle wasn't formed correctly. Blood wasn't flowing the way it needed to. Without surgery, major surgery, the kind performed at only a handful of children's hospitals in the country, Micah wouldn't see his first birthday. I remember the doctor explaining it to us in a small consultation room with fluorescent lights and a box of tissues strategically placed on the table. I remember Daniel's hand tightening around mine until my fingers went white. I remember the words, "staged." Reconstruction, an open heart, and significant financial burden landing in my chest like stones dropped into still water. The estimated cost, even with our insurance, was staggering. The copays alone would have drowned us. And that didn't include travel to Cincinnati, lodging during the recovery period, lost wages. We were already stretched thin. 5 children thin. Overtime every week thin. The kind of thin where you check your bank account before buying milk. Daniel pulled me close that night after the older girls were asleep. The twins were in their bassinets in our bedroom, Caleb snoring softly, Micah breathing in that labored, uneven way that made my stomach clench every time I heard it. "We'll find a way," Daniel said into my hair. "I'll pick up construction work on my off days. I'll sell the truck if I have to. That boy is getting his surgery." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Daniel had never broken a promise to me. Not once in 5 years of marriage. He was the most dependable person I had ever known, solid as the houses he built on weekends, steady as the heartbeat I fell asleep listening to every night. 6 weeks later, he was dead. The call came on a Monday afternoon while I was changing Micah's diaper. A house fire on the east side of town. The roof collapsed before the second unit arrived. Daniel was inside, searching for a child who had already been evacuated through a back window. He didn't know. Nobody told him in time. The beam that fell caught him across the shoulders, and the smoke did the rest. The fire chief drove to our house personally. He stood on my front porch in his dress uniform, hat in his hands, and I knew before he opened his mouth. I knew the way you know thunder is coming when the air changes. The way you know winter is here when the leaves are gone. Mrs. Reeves, he said, and his voice broke on my name. I don't remember what happened after that. I know the girls were watching television in the living room. I know Caleb was sleeping in his swing. I know Micah was in my arms, breathing his difficult breath, warm against my chest. I know I sat down on the kitchen floor at some point, and I know I didn't get up for a very long time. The funeral was on a Friday. Half the county came. Firefighters in dress uniforms lined the church steps, and the engine that had carried Daniel to his last call sat polished and silent in the parking lot, draped in black ribbon. People said beautiful things. People said he was a hero. People brought casseroles and flowers and cards with scripture verses, and then they went home to their living husbands and their intact families, and I was alone. Alone with 5 children. Alone with a baby whose heart was broken in 2 ways now. Alone with bills that kept arriving like they hadn't heard the news. The weeks after Daniel's death became a blur of survival math. Rent was $1,100 a month. Formula and diapers for the twins ran close to $400. Utilities. Gas. The girls needed school supplies, shoes they kept outgrowing, winter coats. I applied for Social Security survivor benefits, which helped, but not enough. I applied for Medicaid, SNAP, WIC, every acronym I could find. I sat in government offices with all 5 children, filling out forms while Lily read to her sisters in the waiting area, and the twins fussed in their double stroller. Caseworkers were kind but honest. These programs can bridge the gap, one told me, but they won't cover the surgery. The surgery. It hung over everything like a shadow with teeth. Micah's cardiologist in Lexington had referred us to Cincinnati Children's Hospital, one of the best pediatric cardiac programs in the country. The surgical team there could perform the staged repair Micah needed. But the out-of-pocket costs, even after Medicaid, were astronomical. Travel, lodging, the hospital stay itself, post-operative care, follow-up visits every 3 months for the first 2 years. The number they quoted me might as well have been $1 million. It was money I didn't have, couldn't earn fast enough, and couldn't borrow because my credit was already underwater from the medical bills that had piled up since Micah's birth. I started a GoFundMe. I wrote the description at 2 a.m. with Micah sleeping on my chest, his tiny fingers curled around my thumb. I uploaded a photo of him in his hospital onesie, tubes and wires, making him look even smaller than he was. I shared it on Facebook, asked friends to share it further. The donations trickled in. $10 here, $20 there. A stranger from Oregon sent $50 with a note that said, "Praying for your little warrior." I cried over every single one. But the total climbed so slowly it felt like watching a candle try to melt a glacier. I stopped eating lunch so the girls could have seconds. I washed clothes by hand when the laundry machine broke because I couldn't afford the repair. I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror. I worked night shifts at the hospital and came home at 7 a.m. to get the girls ready for school, running on coffee and the kind of adrenaline that only desperate mothers understand. The hardest part was the nights. After everyone was asleep, Lily in her bed with the nightlight on, Rosie and Cora tangled together like kittens, Caleb in his crib, Micah in the bassinet beside my bed with the pulse oximeter clipped to his toe, I would sit on the edge of the mattress and stare at the wall. Sometimes I counted his breaths. Sometimes I counted the bills. Sometimes I just sat there, too tired to cry, too scared to sleep, too stubborn to quit. I whispered to Daniel in those hours. I told him I was trying. I told him the girls drew pictures for him and taped them to the refrigerator. I told him Caleb had learned to roll over and that Micah smiled for the first time last Tuesday, a real smile, not gas, and it looked exactly like his. I told him I didn't know how much longer I could hold everything together. I told him I was terrified. And then I wiped my face, checked Micah's oxygen levels, and set my alarm for 5:30 because tomorrow was coming whether I was ready or not. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, tucked between an electric bill and a credit card offer. It was from a law firm in Frankfurt Henderson & Associates, estate planning and probate. I almost threw it away, assuming it was junk mail or a scam. But the envelope was thick, cream-colored, with my full legal name typed neatly across the front. I opened it at the kitchen table while Rosie ate applesauce and Cora stacked blocks on the floor. Dear Mrs. Reeves. The letter began. We are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the last will and testament of Miss Genevieve Hollis, deceased October 14th. Miss Hollis has bequeathed to you her property located at 118 Briar Hill Road, Whitfield, Kentucky, including the house, land, and all contents therein. I read the paragraph 3 times. Genevieve Hollis. The name floated up from somewhere deep in my memory, a face I hadn't thought about in 20 years. She was Opal's older sister. I had met her exactly once, at a family reunion when I was maybe 6 or 7. A tall, elegant woman with silver hair pinned up in a bun and hands that smelled like lavender. She had knelt down to my level, looked me in the eyes, and said, "You have old eyes for such a young girl." I didn't understand what she meant then. I think I do now. The letter explained that Genevieve had no surviving children. She had lived alone in Whitfield for the past 30 years. She had updated her will 8 months before her death, specifically naming me. There was a handwritten note enclosed, sealed in a separate envelope. I opened it with shaking hands. The handwriting was elegant, the kind that belongs to a generation that learned penmanship as a discipline. My dear Elena, it read. I watched you from a distance all these years, even when you didn't know anyone was watching. Your grandmother Opal did her best, though I know her best was not always enough. I have prayed for you more times than I can count. This house was my sanctuary, and I am giving it to you so that it can become yours. There is more here than wood and stone. Look carefully. The walls remember everything. With all my love, Genevieve. I pressed the letter to my chest and cried so hard that Rosie climbed into my lap and patted my face with applesauce-covered fingers, asking, "Mama sad?" "No, baby," I whispered. "Mama's just surprised." The attorney confirmed the details over the phone the next morning. The house was fully paid off. No mortgage, no liens. Annual property taxes were minimal. The property included 6 acres of land and a small barn. It was mine free and clear. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed running numbers on my phone. If I didn't have to pay rent anymore, I could redirect $1,100 a month toward Micah's surgery fund. If the house was livable, I could sell or break the lease on our rental. If there was land, maybe I could grow something, sell something, find some way to scratch together the rest. It wasn't a solution. But it was the first crack of light I'd seen in months. We drove to Whitfield on a Saturday. It took almost 3 hours, the roads narrowing as we left Lexington behind and climbed into the hills. Whitfield was barely a town, more of a feeling a cluster of houses and a general store and a white church steeple poking above the tree line like a raised hand. Briar Hill Road was a gravel lane that wound uphill through oaks and maples, their branches interlocking overhead like a cathedral ceiling. When the house appeared, I pulled over and just stared. It was beautiful. Not new beautiful, not magazine beautiful, but the kind of beauty that comes from surviving. A 2-story farmhouse with a wide wraparound porch, dark green shutters, a stone chimney climbing the east wall. The paint was faded, the garden overgrown, but the bones of the place were extraordinary. It sat on a gentle rise overlooking a valley where fog gathered in the mornings like a held breath. The front door was painted red, the only bold color on the whole structure, and it seemed to glow in the afternoon light. "Is this our new house?" Lily asked from the back seat. "Maybe," I said. "Let's go see." The key was under a ceramic frog on the porch, exactly where the attorney said it would be. I turned the lock, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, layered with the scent of old wood, dried herbs, and something faintly sweet, like vanilla or honey. Dust motes drifted through beams of light that fell from tall windows. The front room was filled with antique furniture, a hand-carved bookshelf packed with hardcovers, a velvet armchair, a grandfather clock that had stopped at 4:20, a fireplace with a mantel decorated with framed photographs of people I didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. The girls scattered immediately, their voices bouncing off hardwood floors and high ceilings. I carried the twins through the kitchen, which was large and warm, with butcher block counters, cast iron hooks on the walls, a deep farmhouse sink, and shelves lined with mason jars of preserved peaches and green beans. Someone had loved this kitchen. Someone had spent years feeding people here, and you could feel it in the walls, a residual warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. I set the boys in their car seats on the kitchen table and began opening cabinets, partly to assess the space and partly because I needed something to do with my trembling hands. The house was more than I had dared imagine. It was sturdy, spacious, and full of the kind of careful craftsmanship that Daniel would have appreciated. I could almost hear him saying, "Look at these joints, Elena." Somebody knew what they were doing. I was reaching into the top shelf of a deep pantry closet, the kind built into old houses like an afterthought that became essential when my fingers touched something cold. Something metallic, wrapped in cloth. I pulled it out carefully and set it on the counter. It was a small wooden box, dark with age, its lid secured with a brass clasp. The wood was smooth, worn to a satin finish by decades of handling. I unlatched the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a brooch. Sterling silver, shaped like a cluster of dogwood blossoms, each petal detailed with a precision that made it look almost alive. In the center of the largest blossom sat a stone, pale blue, catching the light in a way that made it seem lit from within. An aquamarine, maybe. Or something rarer. I didn't know enough to tell. But it was the inscription on the inside of the lid that stopped my breathing. Engraved in delicate script, for saving what mattered most, J. M. Ashford, 1947. I turned the brooch in my hands, feeling its weight, its history. This wasn't costume jewelry, this was something significant, something with a story. And it had been hidden, tucked away in a closet, like a secret waiting for the right person to find it. That night, after the girls had claimed bedrooms and the twins were settled in the master room with me, I sat alone in the kitchen and let the house breathe around me. The floorboards creaked softly, the way old houses do, as though they're stretching in their sleep. The window above the sink framed a sky full of stars, more stars than I'd ever seen in Richmond, and the silence was so complete it felt like a held breath. I was almost asleep in the chair when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, then clearer. Music. A piano, playing somewhere deep in the house. Not a recording. Something live, something present, with the soft imperfections of real fingers on real keys. A melody I didn't recognize but that felt familiar, the way a lullaby feels familiar even when you've never heard the words. My heart hammered. I stood slowly, listening. The music was coming from below me, from the basement, a part of the house I hadn't yet explored. I found the door in the hallway, narrow, painted the same cream as the walls, almost invisible. It was unlocked. The stairs were steep and wooden, and as I descended, the music grew clearer, then stopped. The basement was dry and surprisingly warm, lined with stone walls and lit by a single bare bulb that flickered when I pulled the chain. In the center of the room stood an upright piano, old, its dark wood scarred and lovely. The lid was open. The keys gleamed faintly, as though someone had just been touching them. No one was there. I stood perfectly still, my pulse loud in my ears. The room smelled like cedar and candle wax. On top of the piano sat a photograph in a brass frame, a woman I didn't know, tall and regal, standing beside this very piano, her hands resting on the keys. She looked like she belonged to another century. On the back of the frame, in pencil, Margaret Hollis, 1951. Genevieve's mother. My great-great-aunt. I climbed back upstairs, checked on the children all sleeping, all peaceful, and sat on the edge of my bed with my hands pressed to my knees, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. The house was old. Old houses made sounds. Pipes, wind, settling foundations. There were 100 explanations, and I told myself every single one of them. But none of them explained the warmth. Because the room should have been cold, a stone-walled basement in November, and instead it felt like someone had been sitting there, playing, waiting, and had only stepped away when they heard me coming. I barely slept. At first light, I walked to the general store at the bottom of the hill to buy milk and eggs. The woman behind the counter, a stout, silver-haired woman with reading glasses on a chain, introduced herself as Pearl Mackey, and the moment I said my name, her face changed. "You're Genevieve's girl," she said. "Not a question." "Her great-niece," I corrected. Pearl waved her hand as though the distinction was meaningless. "She talked about you, honey. Kept a picture of you on her mantel. Said you were the strongest person in the family, even if you didn't know it yet." She paused, studying me over her glasses. "You find anything interesting in that house?" Something about her tone made me careful. "Like what?" Pearl leaned on the counter. "Like Margaret's brooch." The air in the store went still. Pearl told me the story while my eggs got warm and my milk got cold. In 1947, a timber baron named James Ashford had a daughter, Clara, 7 years old, who wandered away during a church picnic and fell into a sinkhole near the old quarry. The hole was deep, 30 feet at least, and the walls were slick with moss. Men came running, lowered ropes, but the child was wedged between rocks and couldn't grab hold. Panic set in. Someone ran for the sheriff. Someone else drove to the next town for a ladder. It was Margaret Hollis who climbed down. She was a piano teacher, not an athlete. She weighed barely 100 pounds. But she tied a rope around her waist, had 3 men lower her into the dark, and spent 45 minutes in that hole, talking to Clara, calming her, working the child free inch by inch until both of them could be pulled to the surface. Margaret's hands were torn raw. Clara didn't have a scratch. James Ashford, who owned half the county and could have given Margaret anything she asked for, had his personal jeweler in Louisville craft a sterling silver brooch. Dogwood blossoms, because they were Clara's favorite flower. The aquamarine was Clara's birthstone. He presented it to Margaret at a ceremony in the town square with the engraving. "For saving what mattered most." "That brooch," Pearl said, "has been in the Hollis family ever since. Genevieve wore it on special occasions. But its value isn't just sentimental. A piece like that, custom-made by a Louisville silversmith in the 40s, with provenance and a documented story, it's worth real money, Elena. Serious money. The kind of money that could change things for a person in a tough spot." I gripped the edge of the counter. "How much?" Pearl looked at me steadily. "Enough to save a life, I'd imagine." I drove home in a daze. Micah was awake in his car seat, watching the trees through the window with his huge dark eyes, breathing that fragile rhythm that never let me forget what was at stake. I carried him inside and sat at the kitchen table with the brooch in one hand and my son in the other, and I let myself feel something I had been too afraid to feel for months. Hope. Not the brittle, desperate hope I'd been running on since Daniel died. Something deeper. Something rooted. Like the house itself, old and weathered but standing firm. That night, after the children were down, I heard the piano again. This time I didn't go to the basement. I sat in the kitchen chair, closed my eyes, and listened. The melody was slow, gentle, aching in the way that only real tenderness can ache. It sounded like a lullaby. It sounded like a promise. "Thank you," I whispered into the quiet kitchen. "Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Genevieve." The music played for a few more minutes, then faded the way dawn fades into morning, so gradually, I couldn't tell when it stopped. The next day, I called an antique appraiser in Louisville who specialized in estate jewelry. I described the brooch, the inscription, the provenance. He asked me to bring it in immediately. His voice, measured and professional for the first 3 minutes of the call, had gone very quiet, the way people's voices go quiet when they realize they're hearing about something extraordinary. I packed the children into the van. I buckled Micah into his car seat and checked his oxygen level and kissed his forehead and whispered, "Hold on, baby. Mama's working on it." The drive to Louisville was 2 hours. Lily read stories to her sisters in the back seat. Caleb slept. Micah watched me in the rearview mirror with those deep, knowing eyes that always made me feel like he understood more than any infant should. I don't know yet what the appraiser will say. I don't know if the brooch will bring enough. I don't know if tomorrow will be easier than today, or if the mountain I'm climbing has a top I can actually reach. But I know this. A woman I barely met looked at a scared little girl 30 years ago and saw something worth saving. And she spent the rest of her life making sure that when the moment came, when the need was greatest, that little girl would find exactly what she needed hidden on a shelf, wrapped in cloth, waiting. I know that a piano teacher in 1947 climbed into a dark hole to save a child she didn't know, and that act of courage echoed forward through decades until it landed in my kitchen, in my hands. At the exact moment, my son's life depended on a miracle I couldn't manufacture alone. I know that this house remembers. I know that the women who lived here before me left more behind than furniture and photographs. They left protection. They left intention. They left love in a form that could survive death and distance and time. Tomorrow, I will sit in an appraiser's office in Louisville and learn whether this brooch can save my son's life. Tonight, I'm sitting on the porch of a house I was given by a woman who never stopped watching over me, in a town I'd never heard of 6 weeks ago, listening to the wind move through trees that have been standing longer than anyone I've ever loved. The girls are asleep upstairs. Caleb is in his crib. Micah is in my arms, his heartbeat fluttering beneath my palm, uneven but persistent, stubborn, refusing to quit. Just like his mother. I look up at the stars. I feel something I can't explain, a presence, soft and steady, like hands resting gently on my shoulders. Not frightening, not strange, just there. The way love is there, even after the person who carried it is gone. I'll take care of them, I whisper to the dark. All of them. I promise. The house settles around me, the boards sighing, the walls exhaling. Somewhere deep below, I hear the faintest echo of a piano, a single note held long and clear, then silence. And for the first time since the fire chief stood on my porch and said my name like an apology, I believe that tomorrow might not crush me. That the weight I've been carrying might finally find a place to rest. That hope isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something that finds you, the way this house found me, the way that brooch waited on a shelf for 70 years until the right hands reached for it. I hold my son closer, I close my eyes, I breathe.